The resources that are managed use a common set of verbs, the HTTP verbs, post and get, and there's a couple other that I'll get to that aren't really well used. But the actual representation that's retrieved for a resource, it's dependent on the request and not the identifier. And so when we have extensions on URLs like .lasso or .cfm, .asp, those are superfluous. They don't really define anything about what type of resource that request is supposed to provide. And there's an exception to that, and I'll show you guys in a second what that is. So, in contrast to REST, there's SOAP, remote procedure calls. And SOAP is very verbose, and it doesn't really follow what we call RESTful practices, because what SOAP does is it encourages each application designer to define new and arbitrary vocabulary, so that you can have like get users, save purchase orders, etc. And that's really not good, because every time you work with a SOAP API, you have to find that developer's vocabulary and then understand it and apply it. And there's a better way to do this, and that's called writing RESTful apps. And so to wrap your head around this, what you want to do is you need to understand that each page, you need to think of it as a service that responds to requests instead of a web page. And a lot of people that write Lasso, they're not using some type of framework will write stuff procedurally. And so you have all these different pages, and then each page, you have a bunch of code at the top of the page, and then suddenly you have an include folder, and you start throwing stuff in the include folder, and soon you have all these pages of Lasso code that don't really define what it is that page does. So in the HTTP verbs that we use in REST have to do with the get, post, and put and delete functions in HTTP. And you want to find out more about this, look up Fielding on Wikipedia, and that's a link to Roy Fielding's site. It's kind of a funny URL. And like I mentioned, he's the co-founder of the Apache project. So when we develop RESTful URLs, in truly RESTful applications, there's only 7 functions. And those functions work like this. You have show, which is a get request, create, which is a post request, update, which is a put request, and destroy, which is a delete. And then in addition to those 4 basic ones, you have index, view, and edit. And those are also get requests. The get request for edit returns a page that is either updated or destroyed. So to understand how we want to make this work, when we talk about a model view controller architecture, that's typically in reference to the URL that's provided. And so I put some example URLs up here, including the one exception that I was going to talk to you guys about that I mentioned earlier. And so you see that in the first example, widgets.co.uk, you have /widgets, which in a lot of MVC applications maps to the controller. So the controller would be widgets. The action is edit, and the item that it's acting on is to. So that can be the ID in the table. And then, if you want to follow best practices, you really don't want to expose sequential IDs in the URL, for database records, because you can open up vulnerabilities to scraping attacks and things like that. So you can also represent that with, something that's, a UUID or, another type of dynamic ID for those records. And that's the second example there. So then you have create request. So you have customers create 234. And then the fourth one is the one that I wanted to mention to you guys earlier, and that's the customers/list.xml. And so this one is where you would actually use an extension as an identifier to identify the state that that request should return data in. And so that would be one that you actually return XML, whether you send a static file or your application built the XML file dynamically and served it. Then the next one is an example of a destroy request, and then the last one is an example of what we do in single track to help with search engine optimization and to have clean, readable URLs for like when you email to somebody. And so in this last one, we would map the articles to the controller articles, destroy to the action, and in this example, you probably would be viewing it instead of destroying it, but then you can see that we have the underscore there in the URL, which allows us to easily split that URL and discard the junk and get the ID of the resource for our application. But it also gives readability to it. And so you can do different things like this as you start to work with your application and manipulate the URLs. So how do we handle these? Well, earlier I talked about the application inc file, the application controller, and it's also called a routing file. And so in single track we have an app controllers application.inc. And what that does is that maps the requests to the models, the views, and the controllers. Here's an example of the routing file. So you can see here that we have the single track response variable is set to the response file path. The response array is a split of the response, and we just clean it up a little bit. Then as we go down there, what we do is we have a handler that allows for language links. So when you're building these dynamic URLs, you can do things like shift your controller in your view and your ID. You can switch those forward or back a couple of slashes. So if you wanted to do /en/widgets/list, you can do it like that. Or if you were doing /fr for French. And so based on how you set up this routing file, you can parse and split out a language variable off the front of your URL.